Excellent, thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sarah Carr. I am Director of Advancement in Public Engagement for the Rhode Island Historical Society, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to what is our very first bicentennial program here at the RIHS. Thank you all so much for joining. I want to take a moment to thank our Executive Director, Morgan Greff, who's here this evening, for all of the support she's offered as we've been planning these programs, as well as our Deputy Executive Director, Richard Ring, who's been particularly helpful in planning this series, our Inside the Archive series. I see some other members of our staff here tonight, so I can't thank all of you, but welcome and thank you so much for the help that you've offered as well. And I want to offer a special thanks to our program and partnership coordinator, Catherine Horrigan, who's worked so hard not only on this evening's program, but all of the programs that we have planned coming up for this year. And I quickly want to say that while we're launching this series this evening, there is still time to join us for next week when we will be launching our Drink in the History series. Each month, we're going to be joined by a different Rhode Island beverage partner and pair their offerings with a historic talk. Next week will be Narragansett Beer, who was launched in 1822 brew, especially for our bicentennial. We'll be hosting a Q&A with their lead brewer, and tickets are available now, both for just the Q&A or the Q&A plus a 4-pack of the beer. This is also your last chance to buy either the 12-pack for the whole season or 6 packs of our alcoholic or non-alcoholic programs. So if you visit rihs.org, you can get those tickets today. And I encourage you to continue to read our emails, follow us on social, and visit our website. We have so many exciting things planned for this year, and we really can't wait for you to join us for all of them. But this evening, we launch our Inside the Archive series, which will be a free monthly series in which we take a look at all of the incredible work surrounding our collections, both the materials that are in our collections, the work that researchers can do with those materials, and the incredible work of our collection staff to make those materials, both to preserve them and to make them more accessible to the public. But we thought there was no better way to launch this series than with Alea Henle, whose work, Rescued from Oblivion, takes a look at how historical societies came to be formed in the early United States. So we're so excited to welcome her. A librarian and historian, Alea Henle is head of Access and Borrow and associate librarian at Miami University in Ohio. Her recent book project, Rescued from Oblivion, Historical Cultures in the Early United States, explores foundational moments in collecting and preserving historical materials. Her current research focuses on how people used postcards in the early 20th century and is featured on her blog, aleahenle.com. So please join me in welcoming Alea Henle.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here because Rhode Island was certainly one of the places that I spent quite a bit of time when I was doing the research way back when. And my interest in historical societies was partially because when I started my doctoral studies at the University of Connecticut, I was thinking, okay, I'm a librarian. I came from being a librarian and I went back to being a librarian after I got the PhD in history. I tried not to drink too much of the that particular Kool-Aid. And I was wondering, why do we have what we have? Because what we have to use to write history shapes the kind of history we can and cannot write, or at least what kinds of emptinesses and vastnesses we have to explore. And so I started with historical societies. And part of the reason I started with the historical societies is let's step it back in time to the early 1820s, right before the Rhode Island Historical Society was founded. Let's say we're historians. We are writing a history of something or other, you pick. Where do we get our materials? Because even back then, and there's a lot of differences between how they wrote history versus how we write history today. We're not getting into that one. That's other scholars who are working on that. But they still needed sources to write histories. Where did they get them? So right now, well, one of the places you could go was the government, of course, because nowadays governments have, there's the National Archives. Well, the National Archives only dates to the 1940s. There are state archives, yeah, but the state archives at that time were mostly, well, they weren't in very good order. Very often they were stuffed up in some attic, so subject to all sorts of abuse, potentially. That's assuming that they were all there in the first place. Local records, because one of the things about the colonial and the early Republic officers, and this didn't necessarily just take place then, is that elected officials often fudged the line between writing official materials and writing personal materials. Sometimes they would mention both in the same letter. So even if they made a copy of that letter, was it part of their archive, their personal papers, or was it part of the city or county or state's papers that would pass on to their successor? Indeed, the condition of the Connecticut colonial archives got so bad that in the 1770s, they were actually said, okay, to the governor and various other people, you need to go collect our archives so that, among other things, we can document that we should have claim to various lands in the West. He collected it, and then half of it ended up in Massachusetts. But yeah, we're going to talk a lot about Massachusetts in various ways over today. So governments really at that time, they are a wonderful place, but things just don't stay there. For instance, Jeremy Belknap, who many of you may know as the founder of Massachusetts Historical Society, when he was working on his New Hampshire history, he got a number of sources from various places documenting New Hampshire history. He didn't give them back. And very later, there was some discussion about the New Hampshire Historical Society about maybe we should try to pry these out of Massachusetts. Massachusetts Historical Society does not like to give up things that are not related to them at all, unless they published everything that they want from them. They did give some of the Connecticut papers back, but they gave them back in the early 1900s when they got them in the 1790s. That's the Trumbull papers, if anyone's interested. Okay, so governments they're an iffy place to go, but we're historians, so we can go to libraries, public libraries. Most of them don't have good historical collections at that time. In fact, one of the reasons that a good chunk of the Trumbull papers ended up at the Massachusetts Historical Society was that the collector's son basically said, I think that they would do better there if they go to a library like Yale, they would be food for worms, which also suggests something about the ideas of how much the higher education was involved in preserving. Harvard tried briefly for maybe 1 year in the 1780s or so to start up a big archive of historical materials. They even hired Jeremy Belknap to do that. Yes, I know there's a Massachusetts theme. We'll get back to Rhode Island sooner or later. And Jeremy Belknap tried. He tried, but finally decided, nah, the only reason they want me to work on it is because I'll do it for very little money. And wherever there was very little money, he was sure to be hired. So private collectors. Okay, private collectors are or people who have family papers. They are a great resource if you know who they are, or you can get connected to them. So you have to have those right connections. And then also, what happens to a family collection or a private collection when the person who's holding it dies? What if their heirs don't care? In some cases, they sell them. In some cases, maybe they pass them on. It's very iffy. Or you can go to historical societies, but we're talking about the 1820s here. And in the 1820s, there are only 3, early 1820s, that is, before the Rhode Island Historical Society, there's only really 3 historical societies that have lasted to any degree. Massachusetts, the first one. New York, the second one, which is having their own issues in the 1820s because they spent too much. They spent a lot of it on big festivities. They bought a lot of things that they spent a lot of money that they really shouldn't have. They thought they were going to get more. They even threatened to sell their library, but they managed not to do it. And then there's the American Antiquarian Society, of course, which is also in Massachusetts. So in the 1820s, people in Rhode Island, people in Maine, and people in New Hampshire all look around and say, wait a minute. People in Massachusetts are collecting things about our history, and they're writing our history, and they're getting it wrong, and they're writing it to their fame, to Massachusetts fame. So in fairly short order, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, also Pennsylvania, but they're a slightly different matter, all found historical societies. So, and we can talk about the multiplication of historical societies because the 1820s saw a lot. Historical societies are wonderful organizations in some respects, but they were also subject to a lot of problems because to have a really successful historical society in the early years, and your current officers can tell you how much this is or isn't still the case. You needed a group of active individuals committed to it. Having just one person doesn't work, because if that person dies or moves out of state, the Historical Society usually fails or goes dormant for a while. They need to be close enough to have some kind of regular interaction, because otherwise they were just writing letters to each other, although that can be quite handy for the later historians. I love this New Hampshire Historical Society because they were so separated at some point that some of the things that in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and in New York and Pennsylvania, they're doing face-to-face. New Hampshire had to write letters. That was wonderful. But basically, you've got these fragile organizations organized around the ideas of we're going to preserve things for people to write history. But there's a lot of problems inherent in that. One of the problems is if you're collecting things to preserve for people writing history, what is history? What is valuable to collect? So one of the first things that these places did was they started writing out letters, basically circulating letters, basically wish lists of what they wanted to collect, trying to explain to the people who have the materials, this is what, you've got things that are historical. We would love to take care of them for you. But let's take another step back. Who are the people who are doing this? Because for the first historical societies, there's a very specific type of person generally who is an officer, a member, or a particularly active officer of a historical society. So one of the first things is they're wealthy. They have at least enough money that they can spend time on something that's not paying them a dime, for the most part. They're not the wealthiest around, unfortunately. The wealthiest around are too busy doing other things or making the money or something like that. They're educated. Most of them have some kind of degree. They're professionals. And at that point, professional means doctor, lawyer, minister. Some businessmen, but much more of that, particularly ministers and lawyers. They are also male, pretty much by and large. There are discussions occasionally about letting in one woman member, but usually she's in the third in some kind of honorary capacity and not actually as an active member. Women are definitely involved in this, but in some cases their involvement is covered under layers. For instance, even women as donors are not always easy to find. I have a case for the Rhode Island Historical Society where there is a letter in the collections documenting that David Benedict had gotten a number of resources from his wife's sister that he was to donate to the Historical Society. So these materials are coming from Sally Gano. They're going through him. Guess whose name is in the records as the donor? His is. That's actually one of the few instances where I can suss out some of that, but sometimes it's a lot harder to suss out and say, okay, it's a man's name here. Is it actually his gift? Or is he the family member or somebody else who is acting as the intermediary transmitting the gift from the woman? Also, the members are white, and not just white, they are predominantly of Anglo-American descent. So English, Scottish, maybe Irish, but mostly English. So it's a very particular kind of people. This is slightly different in New York and Pennsylvania, places with slightly more varied populations. But even so, by and large, they're white and they're English descent. And they're largely Protestant. Sometimes different variations of Protestant, sometimes not. Massachusetts was basically they went to Harvard and they were Congregational or Unitarian. There isn't that much difference, whereas Pennsylvania, there's a lot more difference. In New York, there was a lot more difference there. So as I'm mentioning, they're trying to collect materials, which means that they have to explain to the public what's worth collecting. And they do this through circulating letters. One of the first things that they stress, though, and this is one of the things that I found particularly interesting as I was starting to read through it, is They want to collect information. And there are particular facts that they're looking at. So that right now, we usually view what they gathered as sources, but they were looking for the information. They weren't thinking necessarily of, they weren't thinking at all at primary sources. But over the time period, I've read enough of the circulating letters that just tease this out, that between 1800 and 1850, they started moving from trying to describe the kinds of information that they wanted to collect into describing the kind of sources that are likely to have that information, which is an important step in developing the primary source as one of the end-all be-alls. Because at first they're trying to say, okay, we want information that's political, we want information about who founded your town at first, who were the ministers, lists of information, the kind of things that would be in annals back in the medieval times or other things like that. But eventually they start saying, okay, well, we want anything that was produced or written or created in Rhode Island, or created by a Rhode Islander, or created by somebody else while they were passing through Rhode Island, but who has some connection to Rhode Island. So it's a very subtle shift, but a very interesting one. And they're collecting largely written materials. This is not to say that they do not collect other things. In fact, we'll talk a bit more about that in a little later on, but they're particularly interested in collecting written materials, published materials, some manuscripts, usually the manuscripts of people who have gone, some artifacts. Actually, one of the things about Rhode Island Historical Society is that they were very, very interested in finding a piece of the endeavor. They were very dedicated to it. It kept on coming up several times, but basically they wanted, as much as they could, legal records, government records. The Rhode Island Historical Society, for one thing, led the efforts to get copies of all the documents that were over in Europe, in European archives. Because of course, one of the problems about writing about the colonial period was a lot of the documents that related to that were locked up in the European archives. They were sent back there. Maybe there were copies here in the United States, what became the United States, maybe there weren't. And so in the 1830s, there was a very active interest in getting copies of the materials that were in English archives, particularly, but also French archives, Dutch archives, Spanish archives, etc. And so the Rhode Island Historical Society several times tried to get Congress to lead the way. They tried at least 2 times with writing petitions, and they got other historical societies interested and signing on with their petitions. The first time, the member Duty Pierce said, I don't think so, but maybe it's just too late in the season. I'm sorry, too late. The second time, they got to the committee on the House Committee on the Library of Congress. But we're talking about a Congress that didn't really care that much about collecting, that in fact had been keeping the Library of Congress from buying all sorts of materials and basically saying, no, just collect these narrow things. And so with great regret, I believe it was Nehemiah Pierce, who was the, I'm maybe mixing up names, in which case I apologize, who was the senator at the time, who basically replied back and said, nope, I'm sorry. But the problem is that the Western states don't care. And some of the Eastern states, the original 13 colonies, already have all that they need. Now, they actually didn't have all that they need. In some cases, they'd send somebody over and gotten an index of all of the documents that they would want to get if they could get that money. But it still says a lot about Rhode Island that they were one of the few instances of trying to get the other historical societies to gather together. Because one of the problems and possibilities of the historical societies in the early time was that they were so locally focused. There was no National Historical Society. There was a DC Historical Society. It died very fast. There was an American Historical Society that lasted maybe for 2 or 3 years in Washington, DC, that was basically the product of Peter Force, who at that point was a very active documentary editor. But by and large, there were state historical societies In some cases, there were slightly regional historical societies within that, and there were local historical societies. It's very interesting looking more chronologically. I actually stopped my research in 1850 because if I'd gone a decade more, I would have had to deal with twice as many historical societies, and I was already starting to run out of brain space to keep them all straight. But usually within about 20 to 40 years of the founding of the first successful historical society in a state, which is usually either in the capital or in the largest city. In either case, the second largest city usually starts saying, they're not paying us any attention. We're going to go found our own. And I think you'll see if you look at the Historical Society of Rhode Island versus the Newport, that's around the time when Newport founded theirs. It happens a lot in many of the others. In New York, Albany founded one a while later. In Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh founded the Western Pennsylvania Historical Society about 20 to 30 years later. Massachusetts, they started proliferating all sorts of local ones, including right next to Boston, which is of course where the Massachusetts Historical Society was located and was focused. In Essex, in Salem, they founded the Essex County Historical Society, and some of the members of the Massachusetts Historical Society were also founders of the Essex County Historical Society because they thought these things could dovetail very nicely. After all, the Essex County Historical Society was looking for things that would document Essex County in particular, and then also the state and the nation, whereas Massachusetts Historical Society was looking for things about the nation, but about Massachusetts in particular. Of course, being early 19th century Massachusetts people, they basically thought all of New England was Massachusetts. So they didn't necessarily collect all of New England, but in the early days, they were even considering collecting things from Virginia. Actually, they weren't the only ones. The New Hampshire Historical Society also briefly thought, we could publish something from Virginia in our collections. And then they thought, nah, we've got enough stuff in New Hampshire. Why would we go to Virginia for resources? Because one of the other things that the historical societies did was it was not enough just to collect materials. Also, part of their thing was to disseminate copies, to multiply the copies, to make these more available. At least that was the approach that several of the historical societies took. And that's why many of the early historical society collection volumes, to put it politely, they're a mess. There is so much that is, unless you are particularly interested in that, boring to the nth degree. And I say this having read through some of them. If there is interesting stuff, it is often buried and you cannot tell from the title of an item whether or not it's going to be interesting. There's an early volume of the Massachusetts Historical Society collection that has a wonderful exchange of letters, or wonderful series of letters written by the early Mathers, where among other things, they basically accuse the then governor of Massachusetts, colonial governor of Massachusetts, of all sorts of bad deeds, including being absent from the church on Sabbath. You wouldn't guess a thing that it's there from the table of contents or from the indexes when they could put together indexes, which are usually in the 10th volume. But Rhode Island took a different tact to publications. They basically looked and said, we could do all of this, but Rhode Island Historical Society was spending money buying books. So the money you're spending buying books is not money you can spend on publishing things. And at that point, if you wanted to publish, you paid for it, unless you were very, very lucky. So what they did was basically pair with people who are interested in publishing things, either documentary works or works of history. And if it was acceptable to the publication committee, they would allow that book to be published as a volume in the collections of the Rhode Island Historical Society. And they would subscribe for 100 copies, which would basically give the person enough money to go move forward with publication. So it's a very different model. It was a very interesting model. That's why, among other things, you have very coherent volumes in the collections of the Rhode Island Historical Society. So they don't quite resemble the ones that people at the time were basically saying were repulsive to the general reader. That was Virginia. The Virginia Historical Society said, no, we're not going to do this. But there were reports saying that they weren't going to do that. Came out in the Virginia Historical Record, which did exactly that. It was a miscellany with little bits of everything thrown in. Also, many of the historical societies sought some kind of artifacts and or natural history, because at this point, the specialization of societies was still growing. So the idea of history also including natural history, many of the historical societies had that alignment. Whether or not they did basically was connected to whether or not there already was some kind of natural history organization in the area. So for instance, the Pennsylvania Historical Society never collected natural history because there already was the American Philosophical Society in the area. But Boston and New York both did, and then later quietly transferred their collections or deposited them with local natural history organizations. And then we get to issues, and this is one of the things where it's of talking about race. Because to a large degree, these white men did not touch on issues of race, particularly issues with respect to the enslaved peoples. Part of this was because some of their members were in favor of slavery, and they were trying to walk a very fine line between keeping them as members and keeping the people who were in favor of abolition as members. I have an instance where a member of the New Hampshire Historical Society wrote to a former member of the New Hampshire Historical Society who was living in New York and said, basically, I'm interested in your opinion on abolition. And Richard Bartlett, the New York member who was writing back, physically separated his discussion of historical matters from his discussion of slavery and his approach to slavery and racial inequality, which was his idea, and sent them in two separate letters dated the same day. So that was one of the ways that many of the members actually managed to work together on history, was they just basically kept race and slavery out of it. And given most of the documents don't mention it, which means that they were trying not to. There are some exceptions. One of the interesting exceptions was Peter Duponceau, who was president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and the president of the American Philosophical Society and the president of at least one other organization there, simultaneously in his 80s. So go him. Basically wrote, he made one of the rare references to collecting materials documenting the experiences of Black peoples. But he also said, basically, but don't touch slavery because it's not the time for it and there will be strife if we do. And so basically, you can't do it with the bravery of a historian. And I'm sitting there saying, yeah, I'm sorry, but bravery is not exactly one of the prime considerations or qualities of many historians. And so the deliberate absence of slavery was, and discussions of slavery and discussions of African Americans was to some extent deliberate. I mean, I went through, and actually the Rhode Island Historical Society has some of the best documents and documented references and the most documented references to collecting materials relating to slavery in their early accession records. Because one of the things I did as part of my research was, wherever possible, I went through the accession records, creating humongous spreadsheets, focusing on the manuscript items, not so much the printed items. If I'd done the printed items, I would still be working on that right now, and we're talking more than a decade later. But focusing on the manuscript items and focusing on how they were described. And most of the manuscript items relating to slavery that the Rhode Island Historical Society received from the 1820s to 1850 were dated prior to 1790s. So one of the reasons that they were willing, the society had no problem accepting them, was because they were documenting an earlier time. This is also in keeping with the few printed references in historical society collections, where they're talking about slavery. And those usually stop, or at least the two that I particularly found, stopped in the 1790. In one case, it was in Pennsylvania, where they talked about colonial attitudes towards slavery. In one case, it was in Georgia, where they're talking about how the early colonists were complaining about being deprived of the right to have slaves. But largely, they were focusing on times before the members themselves had been born, because that was what was particularly historical. It was an interesting exchange, though, because one of the members found, and he describes it basically as having found it, a large cache of documentary materials that were about to be burned, and he saved them. And most unusually, I wish there were so many more of these, most unusually, he wrote a letter to the Rhode Island Historical Society explaining why he saved the ones that he did. He saved them out of a conviction that nothing bearing a name or a date should be destroyed. But then he took this batch of 200 plus documents and broke them into different lots, some of them which were only, in his view, really worth saving because they had autographs of great men. Then there were other ones that might be worth because of their relating to a certain topic or not. But he also deferred the decision of whether or not to take them to the active member officers of the Rhode Island Historical Society. And this is a very consistent theme over those early years. When I started doing my research, there were a lot of people who gave references to, oh, well, the early historical societies accepted everything. That's why they basically looked like your grandma's attic, if your grandma never moved. My grandma's moved. But actually, a lot of that reputation dates to the second part of the 19th century. The earliest members, they're not accepting everything. If they're going to accept something, usually it's because they see value in it, or they see value in buttering up the person who's giving it. There are a number of instances. I distinctly remember one time when I was sitting in the Rhode Island Historical Society, reading through the early letters. These were the very earliest letters. And one of the members was told off to go over and look through this collection of early colonial Rhode Island, very old family records, and pick which ones to accept. And he basically says, okay, I looked through this box full of mouse gnawed papers. And I'm sitting there in the archive saying, take them all, take them all, take them all. No, he gave some of them back. The mouse gnawed, nothing, they're gonna get, yeah, they probably died in one way or another. And in that kind of filtering, there are opportunities. That's not the only example. There's many other examples of instances where members often would go out, look through caches, and decide what to take. There is a joke among, or has been a joke among staff at the Schlesinger Library that up at Harvard, that basically they could be called the ladies' auxiliary to the Massachusetts Historical Society, because so many of their collections of early women's papers are a match to the men's papers that are over at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm sad to say it didn't just happen then, it also happened in the 20th century, that sometimes historical societies would be given troves of papers and they would carefully abstract all the women's writings and send them back. So there was definitely some selection there. And to a large extent, the selection focused on names, in partly, or known connections. All of the historical societies had somebody who, at least one founder who they really wanted to find and collect anything they could. You can probably guess exactly who that is for Rhode Island. Yes, it's Roger Williams. I distinctly also, yeah, you guys have the root that ate Roger Williams. So anything else, in fact, early on, the Historical Society officers wrote off to their agent in England. They were one of the first historical societies to have an agent in England, although being an agent of a historical society in Europe and sending things back sometimes basically meant you were just happened to be somebody that one of the historical societies members knew, or you were a member yourself, somebody they knew was interested in history and were planning to go over there anyway. And they're like, as long as you're there, how about researching this, 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 and this? And finding anything you can to send back. All lots of fun things. But getting back to the issue of race, I was talking about slavery and the enslaved African Americans. There was a big exception to the issue of race in terms of collections, and that was the indigenous peoples. But how the historical societies went about collecting materials relating to the indigenous peoples also related to their idea of progressive history. Many of the historical societies would basically break the time period. This is particularly visible for the historical societies further west, where they'd say, okay, we were looking for history or materials relating to the indigenous peoples. Sometimes they would specify which tribes, sometimes they wouldn't. Then Spanish, then the French, then the English, and then the Americans. And it's a distinct progression. Okay, sometimes the French and the Spanish are not necessarily always in the same place, but it's that idea that there is one group and there is another group. So a lot of the discussion, a lot of the references to the indigenous peoples presumes their absence, presumes that they are dying off and that they are no longer local. Indeed, one of the things about the historical societies on a larger scale is that by and large, they were only founded in areas once the indigenous peoples were no longer a power. Some of the early historical societies, Minnesota, was founded while it was still a state, a territory, not even a state, because it became an idea of this is okay, this is a civilization, we've got a historical society. But even there, it was founded in St. Paul, on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. In collecting the indigenous people's history, a couple of examples. One is that in the 1830s, the Rhode Island Historical Society received a request from a member or a correspondent in France that there were people, French scientists, who were looking for skulls of indigenous peoples, and they weren't sure that the skulls that they had actually were of indigenous peoples, and could the Rhode Island Historical Society help? And members of the Rhode Island Historical Society did. They went out and they dug up skeletons in a place that was known to be an indigenous burial ground, took the skulls and shipped them to Paris. One of them was described as still having some of the hair on it too. Then there was also the issue of the Rhode Island Historical Society was perhaps one of the most active correspondence that the Society for Northern Antiquaries in Copenhagen had, when that society was looking and trying to document that Vikings had been present in the New World. The Rhode Island Historical Society members got absolutely positively on board with that. They did so much research. They went out and tried to find the Dighton Rock. They tried to find every early inscription that they could, copying the items on the Dighton Rock. They wrote some wonderfully pitiful, or the committee wrote some wonderfully pitiful language, basically saying, we've done everything we could. We're practically tearing out our hair. We found so little, but here it is. And the Society for Northern Antiquaries was delighted with it and promptly asked for more. But they were probably one of the most active. And one of the things that probably related to that was that around that time, they had also put out a list of about 50 topics that they wanted to collect materials on. Only a couple of those related to the indigenous peoples, and those basically only back to a certain point. So if they could have documented the presence of the Vikings in 1100 in Rhode Island, it would have given them additional justification for the land claims of Europeans. It would also have given them a means to potentially have wrenched the starting of the European presence in the Americas down to Rhode Island from Massachusetts, if they could have done that. So it had a lot of potential for them in a number of different ways. And it's very interesting in some cases, the way the different dates show up in there. One last thing about the Rhode Island Historical Society before I break, so you guys can start asking questions, because I've been rambling all over the place here a bit, is that Rhode Island Historical Society very early realized, okay, the way that we're actually keeping everything that we collect is not really that good. We need a really good fireproof building to store it in. Of course, it took them a long time to get the money, but they recognized that. There were a number of other historical societies that were sort of like, oh, no, we can deal without. Actually, if you don't mind showing, I figured I would at least quickly go through some of the images that I have in my book to give some ideas of backing this up. I'm sorry, none of them are of Rhode Island, but go ahead and go into the second the second slide when you get a chance. My computer decided it didn't want to play nice with the internet today and share this. This is a handwritten version of the Massachusetts Historical Society's early constitution, where they talk about basically collecting the information rather than collecting sources in there. And there's very similar language in a lot of other historical society constitutions. In fact, when I shared this with the Quincy Historical Society, and they were like, yeah, we can see some of that language in ours too, even though we were founded nearly 100 years later. Next slide, please. This is an example of the kind of thing that the Massachusetts Historical Society particularly was soliciting and actually started publishing. That was one of the things they published right next to those Mather letters. So they're asking for weather information, where it was founded, basically a topographical description. So this is what they got. Next slide, please. At this time also, the historical societies are being they are in many ways the ancestors of the more scholarly traditions of history, particularly in as much as they start publishing their members' papers. And in contrast, there is the popular history. This is a particular page out of John Warner Barber's historical collections of Massachusetts, where he's doing a completely different thing from most of the historical societies. He is putting a ton of illustrations in there. Most historical societies don't have any illustrations, which is one of the reasons why it's very easy to just at a glance for the early 19th century say, this is popular history. This is not popular history. If it's popular history, it probably has a lot of illustrations. Next slide, please. One of the things that I did also, and I'm sorry, this is not Rhode Island, but this is Connecticut, so it's next door. Connecticut was an outlier in terms of historical societies in a very different way. They ended up having their collection accessible for people to view in the Wadsworth Athenaeum at that time, or the building of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and they had lots of visitors. Most historical societies didn't have open rooms, but they did, and in 1850, they had over 3,000 visitors who signed their visitor registers like this within that single year. And I spent time tracking down transcribing these, tracking down as many as I could in the census to show that basically a much broader swath of middle America back then was interested in history and coming to the historical societies than is represented in the historical society memberships. 1/3 of the visitors to the Connecticut Historical Society, or at least 1/3 of the signers of the register, were women. There were people of all ages, young, old. I found some people who were in their 70s and 80s, young. Well, some of the youngest people didn't choose, because among the youngest, there was a 3-year-old, and I'm pretty sure that 3-year-old didn't care that he was being taken to the Connecticut Historical Society on January 1st, 1950, being dragged along with his mother and a couple of others, but just a wonderful array of people. Next slide, please. Inasmuch as historical societies did collect material items, they were particularly interested in material items that had some kind of history, some kind of connection to big events. In this case, this is one of Connecticut Historical Society's collections. This is the shirt of a man who was killed during the Revolutionary War, and they had a lovely heroic story about it that probably wasn't true at all about how he was killed. Interestingly, when they got the shirt from his family, it was still much more bloody than it is today. And the then librarian actually had it washed to remove most of the bloodstains because he didn't consider it fitting for ladies to see. He didn't think anybody, it was probably a washerwoman who washed it, but he didn't think of her as a lady. Next slide, please. And then there were shoes. The Connecticut Historical Society had some wonderful shoes. Next slide, please, including the shoes that are on the cover of the book, which are some of the things. These are those shoes. They're the shoes of Hannah Edwards, one of the daughters of Timothy Edwards, a sister of Jonathan Edwards. And they were probably made by her and by her sister, Mary Edwards. And there is wonderful language in the descendant who sent these in, who's basically arguing for women's place in and collecting and preserving women's things, using the language of the separate spheres to basically say, you have to have both to have it in there. And the Connecticut Historical Society accepted it, of course, in their accession records. They mostly described it in terms of the male members of her family. Next slide, please. This is one of the interesting things. If you've got material items, how do you make sure that you connect them to any stories? In this case, they were able to write, somebody wrote on the sole presented by Mrs. Horatio Fitch, because they wanted to make sure that these shoes were connected to the story that they wrote in the accession records, that the shoes were made from fabric, supposedly, that had been carried during the Revolution as a flag, probably French, because you can see a little bit of fleur-de-lis on the side. But there are all sorts of iron pots and other things that are in Historical Society collections that they have no clue who they once were, because they've been completely separated from their provenance, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And then one of the things is that it was, even though most of the research that I did was focusing on the historical societies, there was a lot of historical interest outside. And this is a letter from John Ross, where he, to all of the aged and wise antiquarians of the Cherokee Nation, because he was endorsing an effort to collect wisdom about the history of the Cherokee Nation that would then be subject to their reviewing it and keeping it for themselves. And there were a lot of efforts to take history and use it in different ways at that time, just because that's one of the reasons why the number of historical societies kept on multiplying over the years. At first, it was more in terms of place. Go ahead and end the slide show. At first, the multiplication of historical societies was more in terms of place, but over time, increasingly, groups that did not feel connected would create their own historical society. So by the end of the century, different sects of Protestant sects, the Catholics and the Jews, had also created historical societies. There was the Negro Historical Society. There were Swedish and German historical societies, all sorts of different groups that are like, okay, people are collecting history, but they're not collecting our history. They're not doing justice. So that same kind of complaint that the Rhode Islanders and the New Hampshireans and the Mainers were making about Massachusetts were then being made by other historical societies. And it's one of the reasons why so many more historical societies started to come into creation, particularly around 1825 and 1875, because hey, those were, or 1876, because those were years connected to the Declaration Jubilee, the 100th anniversary of the Revolution. They're also related to centennial anniversaries of European American settlement in the colonies. So that's one of the reasons why we've got so many historical societies. And that's one of the things that was very much different from a get-go in the United States versus Europe. They actually also had a multiplication of local historical societies in the 1830s, but most of the countries in Europe had also a central royal historical society under which all the others came. But the US, it went state by state, locale by locale, and that's why we've got so many today. So, and with that, if you've got any questions, I would be happy to discuss things.
Yes, well, thank you, Alea. That was, oh my gosh, on the edge of my seat, the entire presentation. You have a great way of engaging with people when you're talking about these things. So thank you for that. I just want to let everybody know that they can put any questions that they have into the chat that we have for Alea. I can read them out loud. She can answer them. I had a question, if you don't mind me asking. I know I'm being a little selfish, but you mentioned in your book that after the British burned the nation's capital, there was kind of this push to have shared archives between states and, government. So do you think in your research that sharing of archival material has created the longevity of these historical societies and these archives, the ones that have lasted throughout the years? I found that very interesting.
It happens in a lot of different ways. For instance, many of the early state historical societies get their start with the help from the legislature. And one of the things that they can return for that is that they guarantee the legislators access to the materials. But very early on, there are occasions where a historical society will basically say, look, we found this. It's really only this book of records of some kind. It's really only valuable for historical materials. Why don't you let us hold it for you? But as time goes by, especially as the states start organizing their archives, increasingly it's more like, we found this, we think it should be properly taken care of. Or maybe we could make a copy and we can keep a copy, because actually that is one of the things that Rhode Island was, in addition to paying to buy books, they also paid clerks in Massachusetts, in some of the cities, to copy things that related to Rhode Island so that they could keep copies there. So there's a lot of blurriness about that. But by 1850, there starts to become a more Western type of historical society, where basically the historical society is an arm of the government. This is particularly, the Wisconsin is one of the first ones, because Wisconsin, it's to their benefit, they got serious money from the state to do that. And so there's a sort of second one where it's a state arm versus a quasi-public accommodation.
Wow, that was a great answer. Thank you. I appreciate that. Another question that we have is kind of about the narratives that people have that are often overlooked in our archives. And you mentioned that there were, I'm sorry if I say this incorrectly, the Ascension articles, that you're looking for certain items. For somebody who's going into a historic archive for the first time, how can they find these narratives? What are key things they can look for that they can pull to kind of get to that content? I know that archives can be overwhelming. There's a lot of items in there. What would you say is a good starting point for people?
One of the things to think about is approach, if you're going into a historical society or an archive, make friends with the librarians and the staff who work there, and ask if there is anything in the provenance records or in the historical societies or organizations' accession records that talk about what circumstances they got materials under. For instance, as I was doing my research, I was going to a lot of historical societies. I would sometimes make the little brown bag presentations. And usually after I made the brown bag presentations, someone would come up to me and say, oh, I have this wonderful collection of personal papers that completely is up your alley. You really need to look at it. And I would be saying, I'm guessing that the Historical Society got those in the second half of the 19th century. And they'd be like, yeah, how do you know? Part of that was because when I started, I thought I was going to find lots of those, and I didn't. Many of the papers started coming to historical societies later on. Business papers, no, those weren't in there either. So sometimes knowing who gave them, when did the Historical Society get them, how did they treat them? Some of that will be there, some of that won't. If you may or may not be lucky, but it never hurts to ask if there is any kind of provenance or accession information about the materials that may help give you an idea about, okay, what's there versus what might not be there. Or alternatively, who was the person who actually thought these were historical or valuable and actually decided this was the proper place to entrust them. That can be a questionable thing too, because sometimes people donated things and then somebody else came along and said, actually, that belongs to me, give it back. I am still a little bitter that the Connecticut Historical Society gave one item back, or one set of items back, but it's Connecticut, so I won't talk about it more here.
So you're saying that you should befriend your researchers and librarians. That is a key tip. Okay, noted. We have a question from Gabe. Hi, Gabe. Thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate you being here. He says, did you find evidence that in 1822, people were worried that their greatest generation, revolutionary veterans, were dying out, and that's why they needed to collect?
There was definitely an interest in documenting their different states' contributions to the revolution and their states' rights. It didn't stop then. It was later. There's a lovely line from somebody in Vermont who's like, basically they're writing the history of Bennington as though it was all New York and Massachusetts, which is like writing Hamlet with the part of Hamlet omitted. For the 1820s, there were so many things going on at that particular time. There is, of course, the upcoming Marquis de Lafayette's tour. There's a lot of publications of the veterans at that time. Many of them have been publishing because they're trying to get money. I didn't necessarily see a lot of emphasis on collecting the people's accounts, but part of that is also because at that time they were still trying to figure out what is history and what do we need to collect for the writing of history. So they weren't focusing necessarily on different people's things unless they're, well, if you're George Washington, if you're Roger Williams, if you're William Penn, you're in. If you're Benjamin Franklin, you're in like Flynn, to the extent that actually I have somebody who wrote saying, you know, I'm going to keep these Benjamin Franklin private letters because, hey, they're fun. They're better than they're Franklin. As an example, but part of this is also very much shaped in where you are in society and how much you might have to contribute, because the military is actually a really good example of how the early historical societies collected papers. They did it in reverse. If you're a general, then in many cases, there will be a historical society that has volumes of your papers. If you are a colonel, you're not going to have that very near as much. If you're a lieutenant, maybe they have your commission, maybe they have a journal. I actually found one instance where an item was especially described in the accession records as being that of a private one. And the only reason I think it was there was because the letter was dated New York, Camp New York, July 4th, 1776. So that the extent to, they're interested probably in some of that information. They're also certainly usually very interested in collecting anything printed. And there is active solicitation of people of publishers to donate copies of anything that they print. There's at least one newspaper in New Haven that really didn't like that and thought that that was, you know, an extra burden on printers. I mean, you don't go in and ask a baker to donate a loaf of bread, but you ask a printer to donate a copy.
That was a great answer. Thank you for that. I hope that helped, Gabe. We have another question from Elizabeth. She says, excellent presentation. The patterns, collection habits, etc. you've outlined tonight from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York. Did you also see the same or similar patterns in the South? For example, from South Carolina. She said she's tuning in from South Carolina. Thank you for being here, Elizabeth.
Yeah, the South is it's very different there, partly because the states are larger, and although there are still regional rivalries, those don't necessarily play quite as much a part. Even Virginia Historical Society should have been one of the leaders. Virginia should have been one of the leaders in many respects because they had that history back up with Massachusetts. They don't, and actually there's discussion about the Virginia for the first couple of, people who are basically saying, no, let's not organize a Virginia Historical Society because it's not going to last very long. And it's a New Englander down there who basically says, who cares if it doesn't last very long? We'll still have done something. And he's sufficiently convincing that they do organize it. It lasts for about 7 years and then it dies. And then it gets recreated and they do still have the collections sometime later. And now it is the Virginia Historical Society's antecedents. But one of the reasons there's a couple of reasons, for instance, that I think that Virginia was not as active. One is that they didn't have the density of historians in the same place. They didn't have as big cities as up in the North, which potentially meant that you had a number of active people, because remember, to have a historical society that's going to last for very long, you need to have a number of historians who are willing to make it operate and not take any money while they're doing it and put a lot of energy in there. They need to be doers rather than just the people who sit back and don't even necessarily send in their membership dues after the 15th reminder that they're overdue and they're going to be dropped shortly thereafter. Also, the people who were writing Virginian history at that time, and yes, I know I'm talking about Virginia, not South Carolina. I'll try to get a little bit more to South Carolina in a bit, but they're writing in some ways a much more valedictorian history. So it's where you don't necessarily need sources, you just sort of write what your experience is and what you've heard. So there's in some ways a different attitude towards it. And also there's the extent to which there may or may not be quite as much of a push for the same kind of education that a lot of the ministers had up in the North who are going to Harvard or Yale or places like that. To the point that at least one, the New Hampshire Historical Society, one early member is like, we don't want more than a third of our members to be ministers. So, but he was a lawyer. So the Georgia Historical Society is the other one that is the most active during this time in the South. And they actually do some very interesting collecting. They collect some things that relate to the Cherokees. Granted, they're starting this right after or right during the relocation of the Cherokees, so that, again, there's that tension between documenting history and pushing the indigenous peoples out. Where the historical societies start getting far more active is actually, and this I'm going on thinner ice because I didn't really study the second half of the 19th century, but is with the Southern Historical Society after the Civil War, when there is increasingly the realization that if you are the people to write history, you can change the people who were losers into the valorous defenders instead. There are efforts in various of the other southern colonies. In North Carolina, and yeah, I know I'm still not talking about South Carolina. South Carolina, look at the Charleston Public Library for one thing. But in North Carolina, they end up with the Historical Society of a history department at the university, because it sort of gets cut down, and then the president is selling off stuff and sort of mingling his own personal collection with other stuff. So there's all sorts of little not so nice things going on in various places in those. So there's a number of efforts, but definitely there's a number of also historians who've said basically the New Englanders were sort of the Johnny Appleseeds of historical societies, and that they would then move somewhere else to another state and say, well, we have many of the historical societies in the Midwest have at least one, if not more, New Englander among their early members. So because they start having that expectation, and also that because they're all so close together.
That was a great answer. Thank you. I have a final question for you, because I know it's around 8 o'clock and we've taken up a lot of your time, so it's getting a little late. We have a question from Vivian. Thank you for being here, Vivian. We appreciate you writing a question. She says, since so many traditions and values of the new USA come from Europe, was journal writing and personal documentation of life common in Europe, e.g. France or England?
That's not something I've particularly focused on so much. Certainly, there's a lot of people who have kept various kinds of diaries, and all sorts of wonderful diaries, and all sorts of wonderful letters out there that people used to write a lot more letters, and you can squeeze a lot more on a letter than you can in a text, or even not necessarily in an email. Email you can go on and on too. So there's certainly a very long tradition and of writing these things, but also in terms of journal writing, some of the early historical societies would encourage people, if you're going off somewhere, write a journal. Especially, but that was as or more present also in scientific communities. Indeed, I was reading separately a history of the Salem East India Company, where they actually would provide captains with blank journals to write things down as they were traveling around the globe and collecting materials. So there's definitely this tradition of documentary that changes. There's also the extent to which missionaries are writing back reports to the organizations that are supporting them. And very often these are personal relations of some kind. There are some fairly good, basically indexes, or not indexes, but compilations of the different kinds of personal things that were published at the time or written at the time. And because one of the interesting things that I found was that for the most part, most of the things that people wrote and published, that women wrote, that were published either during their lives or shortly after their deaths up through at least around the 1830s, 1840s, were women exemplars of some kind, or women who had been captured by one or another indigenous tribe and then escaped and come back. So for various different kinds of reasons. There were also, though, there was a very active, in different places, very active community of people writing manuscripts, intending for them to be read as manuscripts and then circulating them around. One example of that is, there's an active example around Elizabeth Drinker in Philadelphia. Hannah Mather Crocker up in Boston wrote a number of sermons, which she actually wrote that she presented, and many of them are included under a male pseudonym that actually is presenting her potentially as the rightful male heir of the line of Mathers from which she descended, which can be very interesting in looking at that. So there's definitely that idea that you write things and that you share them. And that's definitely in conjunction with Europe too. I mean, to some extent, that's some of Anne Bradstreet's poems that then are being published for the first time, not necessarily with her permission, in England. And there's that extent to which what are the things are being published in England and then coming back here, or vice versa. But then we can get on a very slippery slope about American literature. And since I'm not a literary historian, I might get myself into big trouble.
Well, that was a great answer. And I love how during your presentation, you even talked about the connection between Rhode Island and Copenhagen. I think that is so fascinating to hear about that correspondence. And maybe in the future, we could fire that back up again at the Historical Society. Maybe we take a trip over there. So I loved that. I thought that was really interesting. My final question is from me to you. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about where people can find your work, if you have a website, if there's a place that people can learn more about what you've written, if you wanted to take this time to talk about that, plug that for yourself.
Okay. Yes, my book is available. In fact, the University of Massachusetts Press that has published it has agreed to extend an offer of, I believe, a 35% discount and free shipping if you purchase it from the press. So yeah, it's out there. It has most of what I've been talking, not all of what I've been talking, because I've been talking about some other things too. I do have a website and I do blog about postcards, although I'm currently on hiatus for personal reasons that I'm not going to go into at this point, but I hope to take it up again, basically blogging through different collections of early 20th century postcards that I somehow got hooked. Actually, no, I know exactly how I got hooked on those. And looking at different connections between, because they're just, I could talk for an hour about them, so we're going to stop that too.
We'll have you back. We'll have you back
and actually,
program.
Yeah, and actually I do have an article coming out in Early American Studies in the next month or two, which looks at, since one of the questions was about journals, it looks at the publication of Sarah Kemble Knight's journal, where she traveled from Boston through Rhode Island to New Haven and then to New York, mostly alone in the 1704. It was published in the 1820s. And then very quickly in Boston, at least, they decided it was fake. And it had probably been written by a man. And so I look at how people were evaluating, trying to decide, is this true? Is this not, given whatever they had at the time? And the different ways, made in different ways that people used for that. So that will be coming out soon. And then I've got I have an article also about Hannah Mather Crocker, since I mentioned her and stuff like that. But since I'm a librarian, I'm also trying to write library scholarship too. And it can be sometimes hard. And then of course, in my non-copious spare time, because I have to do something with all this knowledge that's in my head, I write fantasy fiction under my initials. So I do not expect anybody to go there anytime soon, especially considering that my creative voice apparently has decided that since I have researched the 18th century and the early 19th century, and now the early 20th century, if I'm writing historical fiction, it's not going to be at any of those time periods whatsoever. So, but basically, if you liked this presentation, you'll probably like the book.
Okay, very exciting. And I see that Sarah put some links in the chat if anybody wants to take a look at that. And thank you so much for being here, Alea. Thank you for talking with us. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Make sure to go buy Alea's book so you can learn more about what she had to say tonight. So thank you everybody and have a great night. Thank you, Alea. Bye everyone. Bye guys.